And welcome back to Capital Tonight. States across the country are dealing with significant budget gaps, forcing many of them to make drastic cuts or impose significant tax hikes. This dire fiscal environment has also sparked a debate over possibly changing the existing laws to allow states to file for bankruptcy. Yep, bankruptcy. The idea was first pitched publicly by Republican Senator John Cornyn of Texas, but others have expressed support, including former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Now, my next guest says this is a terrible idea, especially here in New York, where it has not yet been broached, but he is considered a conservative when it comes to budget issues. He is, of course, E.J. McMahon, the director of the Empire Center for New York State Policy. You wrote an op-ed that appears in the Wall Street Journal today and dealing with this issue. I sort of feel like we're having a bit of a Groundhog Day experience, because really what's at the base of this in some ways is that unfunded, not necessarily unfunded, but escalating pension costs and healthcare costs are driving states to a point where they say we're almost at the brink of insolvency.
Well, yes, and I think the debate over this confuses the two different things. First, to make it clear, states can't go bankrupt now because they're sovereign. That is, they make their own rules.
Right, they control themselves.
Municipalities can, but states can't. It's been suggested by some people in recent months that, well, maybe states should go bankrupt. And the main argument in favor of this, which comes generally from conservatives, from my fellow people who are conservative on a lot of these issues, is, well, we can use this. This is a way to keep states from clamoring for bailouts from Congress. And that this is a way that state officials can have a weapon to use against public employee unions that are recalcitrant or resist calls for concessions.
Right, and you argue that in fact governors actually already have power, considerable power in this particular arena. Your argument is, when it comes to the state workforce, that they can just threaten massive layoffs, which sort of seems like we've been there. We're seeing the opening salvo of that.
Well, layoffs are only the start. And in fact, the traditional response of unions to layoffs beyond a certain point is go ahead and lay them off, because they're no longer members of the union. But states have an escalating series of options that ultimately go right to the heart of the union's own existence, at least as bargaining bodies, because public employee unions do not have a constitutional right to collectively bargain on the state level. They bargain, and only bargain in half the states, by the way, on the state level, pursuant to state laws. If there was no state Taylor law, there would be no mandate to collectively bargain with public employee unions. You can alter the Taylor law, a lot of terms of the Taylor law, and even repeal the Taylor law.
Okay, wait a minute. Let's just stop for one second. That's never going to happen.
Well, no, but here's the thing. The argument from advocates of bankruptcy is, this is the theoretical thought experiment here, is, well, if we gave the leaders of states like California, Illinois, and New York a new tool to use, they could bludgeon their unions and say, if you don't go along with what we need, we will file for bankruptcy and a judge will come in and force changes on you. And my argument is, if they're that determined, if they're so determined to get concessions from their unions, they have the tools they need now. For instance, in New York, the legislature and the governor could get together and say, you know what? We're not doing the dues check-off anymore.
But doesn't that require an active, in other words, the legislature and the governor would have to get together and actively
do something,
stick it to the union.
But here's the thing.
But if you're bankrupt, you say, well, I can't help it, we don't have any money, and it's sort of outside of our hands.
First of all,
you have to file for
They have to agree to file for bankruptcy, number one. Number two, in a bankruptcy of a government, this is the way it is with municipal bankruptcies, and if anything, it would be more so with a state government bankruptcy. It's not like a corporate bankruptcy. A judge doesn't become the guy who runs things. The judge wouldn't be the czar of New York. Actually, the judge would have very limited discretion, and the choices he made would still largely be shaped. He would be pointed in directions by the elected leaders of the state.
Okay, but how do we know that? We've never seen a state bankruptcy
we know
before.
that, in fact, the leading advocate of this from the legal side has pretty much acknowledged this. Constitutionally, there's a whole welter of court decisions that go into it, and we have the municipal law. The municipal bankruptcy law is a precedent that's been in existence for 75 years. Municipal bankruptcy judges, in fact, do not, on their own, become sort of bankruptcy czars and reshape municipal obligations. They can't. They don't have the discretion to do it, and they don't. Neither, for constitutional reasons, could or would a judge in a state bankruptcy. What would happen is, you would then, basically the judge would say, well, you've got to restructure your finances, and then it would be up to the governor and the legislature to point him in the direction of the people he wants, that they want it to be taken from. And my argument here is that, in fact, it would go against, the people who advocate this think this is a way to get tough on unions. In fact, as I argue in the case, say, of California, which has a terrible problem, the people most likely to advocate for bankruptcy, if the tool is available, quite possibly would include those very unions and healthcare providers, others who are dependent on the state budget. Because if you're really broke and the state has kicked the can down the road for a few more years, the hole's got even bigger, they can't even come close to agreeing to solve the problem, and they can't solve it. If you are somebody who is dependent on state funds, if you're a union who doesn't want to make more concessions, what you do is you say, we want bankruptcy. You know why? Because in bankruptcy, then you hope that you can then go after bondholders. Their thought is we can get the bond market to make tough decisions for us. Again, I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay. Well, really, we should point out to viewers that this is all entirely a theoretical
Totally
argument.
theoretical.
There is no bill. There
Right.
is nothing going on at the federal level. There is
No.
talk. There is talk maybe of a hearing.
Right.
But the mere fact that we are broaching this subject at all
Right.
just should drive home for everybody just how serious a problem we're talking about. I mean, we are talking about major problems. And of course, you have Governor Cuomo saying, well, you know, we have a $10 billion hole and we are going to cut our way out of it. We are not going to raise taxes. We are not going to borrow. We're
Right.
not going to extend the millionaire's tax, et cetera,
Right.
et cetera. And other people saying that's simply not possible. And now
Right.
there's a battle. Obviously, we've got 1 week to see where the rubber hits the road and we can stop speaking in theoretical,
Right.
hypothetical what ifs.
Right.
But here's the other thing. In terms of bankruptcy, though, I mean, isn't everybody sort of in bankruptcy at just a conceptual level guaranteed to get something? You might get 80 cents on the dollar. You might get, you're not going to get nothing. In other words, if the governor says to you, unions, I'm going to cut 10,000 to 15,000 people, you're definitely, those people are getting nothing. Aren't you going to get a portion of something if you go into bankruptcy?
Well, you're actually ultimately, if you view it that way, that's a little bit of a simple way to look at it, but it's a complex process.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, that's one reason why it would be in the interest of unions, say,
Sure.
and healthcare providers to say, you know what? Why don't you just file for bankruptcy? Now, the irony is the people who are pushing this notion are people who want to crack down on those people. You know, these are conservatives who say this is the way you can have a weapon against, say, unions. And what I'm arguing is, no, this is a way for unions and others to drag bondholders into the discussion.
But you also
and make them take what's called a haircut, basically do a constructive default on your debt.
You also make the argument that the governor could try, if not wholesale layoffs, furloughs or pay freezes, and this is something that Governor Patterson tried.
Well, Governor Patterson never actually pushed hard on the pay freeze. He proposed it and then let it drop. Secondly, on the furloughs, he never proposed a legal route to furlough. The only way to legally furlough people is with legislative approval. He never asked for it.
Yeah,
and he didn't get it, so
Okay.
that's why it didn't happen.
But the unions say, well, we'll just take you to court.
Right. Well, they'll lose. I mean, there's precedents. It's another discussion. There's court precedents that would support their ability to both defer scheduled wage increases, which on the state level they don't need to do because they're not due for any wage increase. There is no need to freeze. There is a freeze.
Right.
On a furlough, anything else he does, he can attempt to do and then be sued. But there's a lot of options he has. And again, right now, their contracts are expired. They
End
can
of March.
reshape. They
End of
can.
March.
Their contracts expire end of March. UUP expires end of June. Theoretically, this is just theoretical. It's not going to happen, obviously, to this degree. But I would point out, their bargaining rights exist only under state law. I mean, if you're really broke, and you say to them, "We need a concession," and they say no, you know what you can say? You're not getting a dues check off anymore.
Okay, EJ.
So though there are tools, and all I'm saying is, if you're determined enough to get concessions, there's tools for you to get it. And one last thing. This talk about state bankruptcy talks about long-term pension obligations and other costs. Really, that has to do with the state's status as an entity that passes money through to local governments. The majority of the pension obligations that the state pension system has are to local employees.
Right.
If you're in a state bankruptcy, theoretically, how does a federal bankruptcy judge go in to reconstruct, abrogate, or renounce any portion of an obligation that the city of Albany has to a retired city sanitation
Right. We do
worker?
not know because we haven't seen it. But let me just
Right.
ask you this. In parting, is New York broke?
New York is in really bad shape, and New York is in the red. And by some measures, New York would be even insolvent if you measured all of its liabilities accurately. But insolvency in the government sector means something different than in the private sector. So
it's gray.
I mean, we are broke in a colloquial sense. We're broke. I've said that and written that.
Right.
Meaning, and we were really broke at times in the last 2 years when we couldn't pay our bills, like we were running out of cash.
Yep.
But is it fixable? Yes.
Okay, it's fixable. We shall see. 1 week until we
right.
see what Andrew Cuomo proposes. In the meantime,
Right.
and I know we will be talking to you, so
Oh,
I
yes.
want to thank you very much,
Okay,
AJ
you're
McMahon.
welcome.